The message came on a Wednesday evening, just as I was wrapping up work and heading home. It was a group text from my cousin Brian, one of those carefully worded family announcements where every sentence felt like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. Family meeting this Saturday. Everyone's expected. Uncle Raymond's house. 2 p.m. sharp. I stared at it for a long time. My first instinct was to ignore it. After all, it wasn't like they actually valued my presence. They just wanted a full audience to hear themselves speak, and maybe a target to laugh at if things got too quiet. I hadn't been to a family meeting in nearly 2 years. Not since the last one, where my Aunt Patricia asked loudly if I needed help finding a better-paying job right in front of everyone. My silence had been mistaken for shame, but it was actually restraint. I could have told them the truth about how I'd been working on something bigger, something that didn't come with quick applause. But back then, I wasn't ready. Back then, I didn't have proof, just plans. And in a family like mine, no one respects your plans unless they've already turned into property or profit. Still, something about that invitation gnawed at me. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the fact that it came from Brian, Mr. Financial Advisor who inherited everything. He'd always carried himself like the family's success story, even though he started 10 steps ahead of the rest of us. I wondered why now they wanted us all gathered. There were whispers that the family estate, an old colonial house in a prime location, was being eyed for redevelopment. Everyone had always wanted a piece of it. I suspected this meeting had less to do with unity and more to do with positioning. Saturday came quicker than I expected. I stood in front of my closet that morning longer than I should have. What does one wear to a meeting where you're expected to be the least? I settled on a plain button-down and jeans. Clean, sharp, but nothing flashy. I wasn't going to pretend to be something I wasn't, but I wasn't going to let them label me either. Before leaving, I slipped an envelope into my leather bag. Not a thick one, just a few pages. Folded carefully, stamped and signed. I hadn't planned on showing it to anyone, not yet. But something told me I might need it today. Uncle Raymond's house hadn't changed. Still towering. Still spotless. Still the kind of place that made you feel small before you even knocked. The driveway was already full when I arrived. Mercedes. Lexus. A Tesla with a vanity plate that read, Winner. I parked my modest sedan down the street and walked the rest of the way, ignoring the glance I got from my cousin Jennifer, who watched me from the porch like I was a pizza delivery guy instead of family. She didn't say hi. Just turned and went back inside. That was fine. I wasn't here for greetings. Inside, the place smelled like expensive air freshener and ego. Everyone was already seated when I walked in, except, of course, for the folding chair at the far end of the dining table. The only one not cushioned. The only one without a glass of water set at its place. I didn't make a fuss. I just pulled it out and sat quietly. Conversations continued as if I'd never arrived. No one acknowledged me. Not a nod. Not a welcome. Just laughter bouncing from one end of the room to the other, mostly about vacations, investments, and the renovation plans everyone thought they were going to pitch today. Brian stood up eventually, clinking his spoon against a glass like he was about to give a wedding toast. Thanks, everyone, for making the time, he began. We're at a critical point in this family's legacy, and it's time we made some real decisions, especially about the property. Murmurs rippled around the room. Heads nodded. My Uncle Raymond leaned back, hands folded behind his head like a man about to listen to bids. And then Brian looked right at me for the first time and said, Of course, we'll all contribute what we can, though obviously, not everyone here is in the same financial bracket. The laughter that followed wasn't loud. Just enough for me to hear it. Just enough to make its point. I kept my face calm, but inside, something shifted. I was used to being underestimated. I was used to being the one they looked past. But today, they had made one critical mistake. They had invited me. I kept my posture straight, even as the chair beneath me creaked like it was about to give out. It was no accident that this folding chair, the only one that wobbled slightly, was where I had been placed. Every other seat was plush and high-backed, perfectly aligned around the family's long mahogany table. I had been positioned deliberately, not just at the far end, but at a literal lower level, like they wanted to make it clear that I sat beneath them. The water glass that had been missing when I arrived? Still missing. No one offered to get one. I didn't ask. As Brian droned on about legacy and shared responsibility, I studied their faces. Aunt Patricia, who once offered me a bag of used clothes in front of everyone like it was charity. Jennifer, who always found a way to bring up her fiancé's new law firm whenever I was in earshot. My older brother Martin, sitting 2 chairs from the head, nodding with his arms crossed. He hadn't spoken to me in months, but here he was acting like we shared the same dreams. They weren't here to include me. They were here to be seen talking about big things while assuming I had no role to play in any of it. Brian flipped through a few slides on a laptop he brought in, projecting charts onto a screen like he was leading a boardroom. Now, the market value of the family estate is trending upward, he said, adjusting his collar like he was on CNBC. We've got 2 developers expressing interest. But before we talk buyers, we need to talk about who's got skin in the game. He looked around the room slowly, nodding at each person, then landed on me last. Of course, some of us are better positioned than others. Another soft laugh from the table. It was polite enough to be deniable, sharp enough to cut. I felt the eyes shift. A few glanced at my shoes, plain but clean. One cousin, Tasha, actually whispered something and chuckled while looking my way. I didn't react. My silence, once their proof that I was embarrassed, had become my greatest weapon. Because silence draws attention, and people start to wonder what you're thinking. I just sat back and watched them toss numbers around like poker chips, each person puffing their chest with a little story about what they might be able to contribute. It was laughable, really. Most of them had never worked a day in their lives without a safety net stitched together by inheritance and family favors. Uncle Raymond spoke up, his voice heavy and authoritative. I'll say this, we'll keep the estate in the family if the buy-in is serious. No lowballers, no dreamers. That word, dreamers, was pointed. He didn't need to look at me when he said it. The implication hung thick in the air. I had always been the one they accused of dreaming too big for my bank account. When I tried to start a small side business 3 years ago, and it failed, they passed the story around like popcorn. He means well, they'd say with that smug tone only family can get away with. But some of us just live in reality. Aunt Patricia chimed in next, turning toward me as if she had just remembered I was in the room. Sweetheart, you know we love you. But this is a serious financial move. No offense, but I think it's best if the heavy lifting is handled by those who've had more success. She smiled like she was offering me a warm towel. The table murmured in agreement. Even Martin didn't speak up for me. I looked around at them, these people I shared blood with, taking turns gently confirming that I was out of my league. And that's when Brian dropped the final jab. We don't want to pressure anyone into participating, especially if finances are tight. No shame in sitting this one out. He smiled, and the room followed his cue like well-trained dogs. A few sipped wine. Someone coughed to hide a laugh. And then Aunt Patricia said it, the line that tipped it all over. Let's not forget, he's always been the poor one in the family. I looked at her, and she didn't flinch. The table roared, not with volume, but with energy. That kind of laughter where people don't even realize how cruel they've become, because they've done it so often it feels normal. I let it sit. I wanted every one of them to feel their moment of pride, to feel big, superior, confident in their old assumptions. I gave them a pause so long, they thought I was either ashamed or defeated. Then I reached for my bag. I placed the envelope gently on the table. Flat, centered, calm. Their laughter stuttered and then stopped altogether. Before we keep going, I said, my voice clear but low, there's something I'd like to share. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Funny how quickly laughter can die when confidence gets challenged. The envelope sat untouched in the center of the table, like a crack in their polished version of reality. I didn't rush. I wanted them to feel the pause. I wanted the weight of it to settle in, to press down on them like their words had pressed down on me for years. Aunt Patricia, who just seconds ago had proudly dubbed me the poor one, adjusted her necklace and avoided eye contact. Brian stared at the envelope, trying to read it without opening it. The shift was starting, and they felt it. I've listened to all of you speak like I wasn't here. I began slowly, keeping my tone calm, composed, even. I've been treated like an afterthought at every family gathering for as long as I can remember. I've watched you all pass judgment, whisper behind my back, laugh at my failures. And I said nothing. My voice didn't shake. Not because I wasn't angry, but because I was finally beyond anger. I had stepped into clarity now, and clarity doesn't need to yell. But before you decide who belongs in this so-called legacy, I continued, tapping the envelope with 2 fingers, you should probably see this. Brian raised an eyebrow and leaned forward with that annoying smirk he always wore when he thought he was about to win. What is it? I resumed. A GoFundMe request, he chuckled. Jennifer laughed, followed by a few other cousins who never had original thoughts, but were always quick to echo Brian's. I let them finish. I waited until the smugness had fully returned to their faces. Then I slid the envelope across the table until it stopped in front of Brian. Open it, I said. He glanced at Uncle Raymond, who nodded slightly, curious now. Brian opened the envelope like it was a prank, unfolding the papers with exaggerated flair. Then he froze. His smirk faded. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the documents, line by line, page by page. Slowly, his face turned a shade paler. The room waited, watching him. What is it? Jennifer asked, growing impatient. Brian didn't answer. He just looked up at me, stunned, then back down at the final page, a signature. A notary seal. A transfer of ownership. I took a deep breath and spoke clearly, deliberately. That, I said, is the finalized purchase contract for the Harrison Avenue property. The room went still. The one you all just spent the last 20 minutes arguing about. I paused, then let the next sentence land like a strike. It's already mine. Gasps. Audible confusion. Uncle Raymond leaned forward like he hadn't heard me right. Wait, you bought it? And Patricia's mouth opened, but no words came out. Brian finally found his voice. You bought the family estate? His tone wasn't angry, it was panicked. Because he realized too late what he had missed. What they had all missed. Yes, I said, nodding. I made an offer directly to the current trustee 3 weeks ago. All above board. All cash. I looked around the table. While you were busy mocking me, I was making moves. Silence followed. It was the kind of silence that's louder than any insult. Jennifer finally snapped out of it and whispered, but how? Her voice was laced with disbelief. You don't even, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence without sounding cruel. And there it was, the final straw. The moment they realized they had built their entire image of me around a version that no longer existed. I stood up slowly, not in a dramatic way, but like someone who finally felt free to take up space. You don't know what I do, I said. None of you ever asked. You just assumed because I wasn't flaunting it, I didn't have it. But I've been working, investing, building a business quietly. While you were measuring worth by what people wear and drive, I was building equity and sealing deals. Brian shoved the papers back into the envelope like he wanted to unsee them. You blindsided us, he muttered. No, I said, locking eyes with him. You blinded yourselves. And Patricia tried to salvage the tone with a laugh. Well, sweetheart, that's quite the surprise. Maybe we can all still work together on this. Keep it in the family, She said it like she hadn't just called me poor minutes earlier. I shook my head. You already made it clear who you think belongs. I'm just making it official. I looked down the table at the people who had spent years trying to shrink me, trying to write me out of the family's narrative. And for the first time, I saw the flicker of something I had never seen in their eyes before. Respect. Maybe even fear. Either way, it was finally mine. It sat there, still, silent, undeniable. That envelope on the table had done what my voice alone could never do. Shift the balance. And now they were scrambling, grasping for new expressions, reworking their words, backpedaling through years of unspoken superiority. The same relatives who barely nodded in my direction before now watched me like I had become a completely different person. But I hadn't changed. I was the same person who used to sit in the farthest seat at every gathering. The same person they never included in the real conversations. The only difference was now I held the deed. Jennifer spoke next, trying to soften her tone, probably hoping to walk back her laughter from earlier. Wow, that's impressive, she said. We had no idea you were even interested in the property. I looked her squarely in the eye. You had no idea I was interested in anything because you never asked. None of you ever did. You didn't see me. You saw a stereotype. Someone to mock. Someone beneath you. The words weren't meant to wound. They were just the truth. And that's why they landed. Because they'd never had to hear it said out loud before. Uncle Raymond cleared his throat, trying to reassert control. I think we all need to take a step back here. This is a family matter, and emotions are high. I interrupted him for the first time in my life. This was never about emotions. You all made it about status a long time ago. I just learned how to play by your rules. Quietly. And better. The silence that followed was different from the last ones. This time, it wasn't shock or confusion. It was discomfort. The kind that comes from being forced to see someone you thought you knew, someone you thought you could predict, in a whole new light. Brian folded his arms, clearly still trying to hold on to his role as the orchestrator of the meeting. All right, he said, trying to sound diplomatic. So you bought the house. But that doesn't mean we can't work together on what comes next. Maybe you'd consider co-investing, bringing us in. No, I said firmly. I didn't buy this to split it with anyone. I bought it to end the discussion. There is no what comes next. I own it. His face twitched. He wasn't used to being shut down, especially not by me. But this wasn't the version of me he knew. That version no longer existed. Aunt Patricia raised her wine glass as if to toast. Well, she said with a hollow laugh, I suppose you surprised us all. You should have told us what you were working on. Maybe we could have helped. The gall of that statement almost made me laugh. Helped? Help? I said, keeping my tone flat. Like when you publicly joked about my job title. Or when you handed me your hand-me-down shoes and told me to wear them to interviews. No thanks. I built this on my own. Without handouts. Without backdoor deals. Without family favors. I took a sip of my own water and leaned back. And that's exactly how I'm keeping it. At that moment, I watched the atmosphere collapse. Not loudly, but completely. Like a balloon slowly deflating, the entire illusion of control and hierarchy at the table wilted. No one said anything for a full minute. It was strange, being in that house I had visited so many times before, always feeling like a visitor in my own family. And now somehow, I was the one holding the key. Not just to the property, but to the future conversations, the next invitations, the next decisions. That envelope had cracked something open. It had undone years of quiet dismissal and rewritten the script. I looked around the table and saw them, one by one, trying to mask what they really felt. Envy, embarrassment, maybe a little admiration, though they'd never admit it. But the truth was, I didn't need their approval anymore. I had spent years trying to earn it, bending over backwards, playing polite while they laughed at me like I was a joke they never got tired of. But now, I saw clearly, the joke had been on them. Because while they were busy talking about wealth, I was creating it. While they dismissed me as poor, I was buying the very land they wanted to inherit. And I hadn't done it to get even. I did it to break the cycle. You always thought I was behind, I said, standing up slowly and picking up the envelope. But the truth is, I've been ahead this whole time. Just quietly. I slid the envelope back into my bag, calm and certain. And the next time you call a meeting about property, I suggest you start by checking who already owns it. Then I turned and walked out, leaving behind their wine glasses, their stunned silence, and their carefully constructed seating chart. And as I reached the door, I heard it out. Just once, Brian's voice, low and barely audible. Damn. That one word was all I needed. I didn't look back when I stepped outside, but I knew they were still sitting there, probably stunned into stillness, replaying the last 5 minutes like a glitch in their carefully controlled reality. The air outside felt sharper, lighter, as if I had walked out of something more than a house, as if I'd finally stepped out of their shadow. I took a deep breath and started down the stone steps, gripping the strap of my bag where the deed still rested, warm and real. For years, they had looked down on me, assumed I was the one lagging behind. But in that moment, they were the ones who had been left speechless. And I hadn't even raised my voice. My phone buzzed in my pocket before I even reached my car. It was a message from Brian. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew the tone, something dressed in false humility, maybe an attempt to collaborate, to restructure the plans, now that I held the only asset that mattered. I slid the phone back into my pocket and laughed quietly to myself. The same cousin who once told me, you can't build wealth with dreams, now needed a peace of mind to stay relevant. The irony tasted better than any toast they could have raised in that house. I got in my car and sat for a moment. No radio. No movement. Just me, and the quiet. And for the first time in years, the silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't something I carried like a punishment. It was peace, a confirmation. I thought about all the times I had overheard them call me a failure. All the little side glances at weddings and birthdays, the backhanded compliments about my humility, the jokes passed around under the guise of family humor. They had worn those laughs like armor, but now they had nothing to hide behind. I hadn't just bought a property. I had purchased back my dignity. But dignity wasn't all they'd underestimated. They had mistaken patience for poverty, silence for weakness, focus for failure. And that mistake had cost them the one thing they thought they were entitled to, the estate. The old Harrison Avenue house was more than just real estate. It was a symbol. It was legacy. It was leverage. They had all been positioning themselves for it, preparing pitches, drafting plans behind closed doors. And I had walked in with none of that. Just a quiet deal, ink already dry. Their inheritance dreams vanished in an envelope I carried under my arm. I spent the rest of the day in the city, took myself out to lunch, walked through the park, and sat at a cafe reading emails on my tablet while I watched the world move. No one knew what had just happened in that house. No one knew how many years of subtle humiliation I had just reversed in a single conversation. But I didn't need them to know. This victory wasn't for public approval. It was for me. It was for the version of myself that used to rehearse comebacks in silence after family dinners, then cry in private when no one was around. That evening, I got another text, this time from Jennifer. She was more direct. Hey, just wondering if you'd consider co-investors. We'd really love to be a part of whatever you're planning. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just a new angle now that the deck had been reshuffled. I read it once, smiled, and deleted it. I didn't reply. That was the difference now. I didn't have to. They'd never considered me a decision maker. Now, I was the only one with the power to decide. And I had already made mine. Later that week, the emails started. Formal ones. From Brian. From his father. From one of my uncles who hadn't even spoken to me that day. Perhaps we can find a mutually beneficial path forward. It's not too late to work together as a family. We're stronger when we're united. It was amazing how fast people remember the importance of unity once the power isn't in their hands anymore. But where was that unity when they called me poor? Where was it when they laughed while I sat at the end of the table with no glass, no voice, no place? I printed one of the emails out and pinned it to my corkboard, just as a reminder. Not out of spite, but to remind myself of the shift, of what it meant to bet on yourself and win, of what it felt like when the people who ignored you were suddenly forced to knock. And not just knock, but wait. The thing about revenge is that I never planned on it. I didn't show up to that meeting with the goal of humiliating them. I brought the envelope just in case someone pushed me too far. And they did. That push turned into a pivot. That moment turned into a message. And now, everything had changed. The boy they laughed at was gone. And in his place was the man who bought the deed. And though no one said it out loud, I knew what they were all thinking now. Who's per now? It was a full week before I heard from Uncle Raymond himself. A formal voicemail, stilted and rehearsed, like he was reading off cue cards written by someone else. I think there may have been some misunderstandings at the last meeting, he said. Family comes first. Let's find a time to talk. I listened to it twice. Once to hear his words, and once to hear what he didn't say. There was no apology, no admission. Just a hope that now that the asset was in my hands, I'd be more gracious than they had ever been when it was the other way around. I didn't call him back. There was nothing left to say. The time for them to see me, to listen to me, to treat me like more than background noise, that time had passed. For years, I had sat through holidays and birthdays and Sunday dinners at that very table, listening to the same voices dominate every conversation. The same relatives who dismissed my ideas as cute, and who used the word ambition like an insult. I remembered every smirk, every side glance, every time they used my silence to make themselves feel bigger. And now, the table had turned, and they were the ones with nothing to say. 2 weeks later, I visited the property again. Alone this time. I had the keys. The house was quiet, every room filled with the weight of history and a dozen faded memories I never got to be part of. I walked through the old dining room, ran my hand along the edge of the table where they once made me sit at the far end, and then I smiled. Because I no longer needed their seat. I owned the table now, every inch of it, not out of vengeance, but out of quiet, measured, undeniable ownership. I stood in front of the fireplace where Uncle Raymond used to give his long, bloated speeches about legacy and success, always followed by polite applause. I sat down in his chair, the one at the head of the table, and leaned back, imagining the faces from that meeting again. But this time, I wasn't small. I wasn't forgotten. I wasn't poor. I was the one who had outlasted them, outworked them, outsmarted them. And I had done it without fanfare, without help, and without the need to become someone I wasn't. As word spread, the tone of the messages I received began to change. Cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly wanted to catch up. A few asked if they could tour the property sometime, like I had opened a museum and was offering day passes. One even had the audacity to suggest I host the next family gathering there. I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't need to. They'd made their position clear for years, and now mine was clearer. I wasn't angry. I wasn't cold. I was simply done. You see, what they never understood was that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes silence is strategy. Sometimes the ones you ignore are the ones who are paying the most attention. I had watched them for years, how they moved, how they dismissed people, how they clung to status like it was truth. And I knew that the only way to truly shift the dynamic wasn't to argue, or beg, or hope for inclusion. It was to own the thing they thought they already controlled. And I did. One signature, one envelope, one knock on the trustee's door. That's all it took. Not because it was easy, but because I was ready. Because I had put in the work they never saw. And now, they couldn't unsee it. They couldn't unknow it. They couldn't go back to the version of the story where I was the poor one, the dreamer, the background. That story was over. As I walked through the house that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the hardwood floors, I realized something else. I didn't need this property to feel powerful. I already was. This house wasn't a trophy. It wasn't revenge. It was a reminder that betting on yourself in silence is still a bet worth making. That dignity can't be measured by applause. And that sometimes, when the table turns, it does so without noise. Just a calm reshuffling of power, and a quiet smile from the one they never saw coming. I walked out of that house, locking the door behind me, not just to protect it, but to close a chapter. Not in bitterness, not in pride, but in peace. And I never sat at their table again. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or laughed at by the very people who should have lifted you up, this story is your reminder that success doesn't need permission. Sometimes the best response is quiet progress. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who's building in silence too. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where the underdog doesn't just survive, they rise.